Hey, this is Joni. Last week on Thursday, I gave an interview to Ljubisa Ivanovic from Euronews Serbia. And in this brief interview, I discussed the situation north of Kharkiv with Russia's offensive stalling there. And I also discussed the situation with the restrictions on hitting Russian soil. This interview was filmed on Thursday, so many things have changed since. On Thursday afternoon and Thursday evening, we received information that the US had actually changed their policy. So what is discussed in this interview in that sense is not up to date. But anyways, here comes the interview.
So let's start with the obvious of these couple of days. There is a big debate whether the Western countries should allow Ukraine to use their weapons, military actions inside Russia's territory. And as we can hear, David Cameron, British Foreign Secretary, is for that. Americans are reluctant. We can wait for the others, but I would like to hear, what do you think about this initiative?
I think it's actually quite a big strategic mistake by Putin and Russia to start this diversionary offensive north of Kharkiv, because until now, for over 2 years, most Western allies have banned Ukraine from using Western weapons on Russian territory. And now that this diversionary offensive happened, as a result of that, Ukraine has managed to show their urgency and to actually convince these allies to change their mind for many of them. I think that obviously we don't know all the secret deals that have happened behind closed doors during the last 27 months, and those might explain why it has been banned for Ukraine to use those weapons on Russian territory. But if we forget about that, it makes absolutely no sense to give weapons and not allow Ukraine to strike Russian territory. It's like asking someone to play a football game where your opponent is allowed to play off limits and you're not allowed. Russia keeps moving troops in and out and moves logistics outside, and it doesn't make sense not to be able to hit them. Fortunately for Ukraine, Ukraine has quite a big defense industry, and they've inherited quite a lot of weapons from the Soviet times as well. So Ukraine has been hitting Russian territory for the last 27 months, but now hopefully they will be able to do it also with Western weapons that are given to them.
We can look at this situation from a different angle. For example, from Russia's point of view, Crimea, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donbas, Lugansk, all these regions are technically, from Russian point of view, part of Russia. So if Russia is threatening to retaliate, they can do it already, because Ukraine is hitting targets in Crimea, for example, every day. So what is the difference between hitting Crimea or Belgorod from Russian perspective?
It actually shows, as you said, that it's a bit of a paradox. It shows that Russia doesn't actually see Crimea and the annexed regions as part of Russia the same way as Belgorod is, or official Russia is, because if Russia would care as much about these annexed regions, they would have retaliated a long time ago already, because Ukraine has been hitting those nonstop, also with Western weapons, for the last 27 months. So Russia clearly differentiates the occupied regions that they on paper consider Russian, but in reality, Russia doesn't consider them the same as official Russia. So that's a big paradox on Russia's side.
And what would retaliation mean in practice? I mean, they can bomb Kiev, but they are doing it already. China is obviously firmly against the use of tactical nuclear weapons. So what would be the choice for Russia if they want to retaliate on such an attack? What do they have on their disposal in a military sense?
Russia doesn't have much. Every time there have been red lines during this war, Russia has talked a lot, threatened a lot, and at the end what they do is they will have 1, 2, 3 nights of extensive strikes on civilians and on civilian infrastructure, but they do that anyway, so it's not something new. They did that last night. They've done it many, many times to Ukraine during this war. And obviously Russia can play on gray areas. They can use a bit of chemical weapons, or they can make small moves, but as you said, they cannot use tactical nuclear weapons because China is against it, the US is against it. The US has told Russia what they would do if they would use tactical nuclear weapons. And also on a military level, using tactical nuclear weapons doesn't help Russia. They would not invade Ukraine as a consequence of using tactical nuclear weapons. So Russia is kind of stuck. They can terrorize the Ukrainian population a bit more, but they cannot do much in terms of military things as a consequence.
Another topic that is quite interesting in recent days is the statements from some Baltic countries. The French president also said that he cannot exclude sending boots on the ground, Western soldiers in Ukraine. But first of all, I would like to clarify one thing. Estonia, for example, and Latvia are speaking about the military instructions. They are already in Ukraine, such as some military instructors from United Kingdom or some other countries.
Yes.
Is it serious? Do you can imagine in coming weeks, months, years, who knows, that the French military and some other Western countries' military will send the soldiers for combat purposes, not only as instructors?
I think, as you said, it's very different to send troops for combat and for instruction. What Ukraine needs now is actually not so much combat, because one brigade of Western troops wouldn't make much of a difference in that level. Ukraine has a lot of manpower, it just doesn't have enough trained manpower. So Ukraine is currently mobilizing, and as Russia is attacking everywhere on the front at the same time, Ukraine cannot have many of its brigades out of the front, and those would have been very useful to train the new troops that are being mobilized. So Ukraine is lacking instructors right now. And during the last 27 months, the West has been training a lot of Ukrainian troops, mostly outside of Ukraine, in Poland, France, Spain, and many other countries. As you said, a lot of Western countries, including France and the UK, have had instructors, not officially, but they've had some advisors and instructors in small numbers in Ukraine. And moving most of this instruction to Ukraine is much smarter and makes much more sense in terms of logistics and saving time. So right now, sending instructors doesn't mean that there will be any combat or that would ever happen. But it's a key thing for allies of Ukraine to send instructors to Ukraine and make the mobilization easier and more smooth, so that Ukraine can have enough troops ready by the end of the year.
Already at the beginning of the Kharkov offensive, military experts said that it is a diversion, that the real attack won't be there because Russia has around 30,000 manpower north of Kharkov. And that's not nearly enough to capture a 1.5 million city of 1.5 million people and military, of course, around it. And if we know that, Ukraine most definitely know that. What is the tactical or strategic aim for Russia in this diversion?
The diversion still makes sense, even if it hasn't necessarily worked until now. It still makes sense because if Russia sends troops, which are that far from the main axis, which is near Chasiv Yar, Ukraine is still forced to send troops there as reserves to defend. And for Russia, this diversionary tactic is not only a diversionary one. Russia also wants to create a buffer zone, which is more of a political tactic for them. So because of what they've been using as propaganda with bombings of Belgorod and things like this, they have been discussing this buffer zone for a long time. And this attack north of Kharkiv has a double goal for them. So it has this military goal of forcing Ukraine to move some of its few reserves to that area, and at the same time to create this buffer zone. For now, both have failed because Ukraine has moved some troops, but not very big amounts, and they have managed to stop the advances, and the buffer zone is clearly not big enough to change anything in terms of Belgorod or other places. But this is not over yet. Russia hasn't used all of its troops that are in the area, and there might actually be 50,000 instead of 30,000, and they have been moving troops around near Sumy and in other areas more west from that area. So Russia is likely to try many other diversionary attacks, and they could surprise us and also make some attacks in the south, which they've been doing the whole time. So this isn't, when you think about it, this isn't a dumb plan, but the execution hasn't really worked in Russia's favor so far.
Can you comment a little bit about this big change at the top of Russian Ministry of Defense? Last year, of course, Prigozhin is out, Surovikin is out, now Shoigu is out, Valery Gerasimov is still General Chief of Staff. But what does this mean? This is the only second civil head of the Ministry of Defense. Before him, that was Anatoly Serdyukov, if I'm not mistaken, during the Georgia war, and it did not go well with the Russian army. Traditionally, Russian army does not like civilian to be at the top of Ministry of Defense. But this choice of new minister is quite interesting because he's an economist. Obviously, the aim is something different, to put Russian economy completely or predominantly ready for a long war effort.
Yes, Russia understands that it's not going to achieve its strategic initial goals of this war anytime soon, and likely maybe never, but their initial strategic goals are not attainable at this point. And Russia also understands that its war is not sustainable economically because Russia is losing much more equipment than it can produce currently. Russia is actually lucky because it inherited a huge amount of Soviet weapons which have been stuck somewhere further east in Russia. And Russia has been producing lately somewhere around 1,500 tanks a year. out of these, 80% are actually old, refurbished or modernized tanks from these Soviet stocks. So it means that they only produce a couple hundred new ones a year, but they still lose over 1,500 a year. So this is a situation where Russia needs to increase its production at a huge pace if it wants to still be able to fight once these stocks are depleted. And analysts from serious think tanks don't have a consensus on when these stocks will be depleted, but the general analysis is that within the next 24 months, most of these stocks will start being depleted. Some weapon systems will deplete faster than others, but still that's quite a worrying trend for Russia, because Russia's way of fighting war is one with huge losses in terms of human and material losses. And they need to be able to replace those material losses. And right now they cannot. So Belosov comes at this point, and his role will be to audit the MOD and to make it much more efficient. And in some ways he might be able to do that. But this also has downsides for Russia, because one of Russia's few strengths in this war compared to Ukraine has been that it actually has more resources and it's not scared of using them, even if it's unsustainable. So Russia has been able to capture small cities such as Avdiivka or Bakhmut by using huge amounts of troops and material. And this is not sustainable, but they've done it because they don't care and they can make fast decisions and non-rational decisions. And with the arrival of Belosov, these decisions will likely become more rational, slower, more bureaucratic. So that's also one downside for Russia. But at the same time, he will make the MOD financially more sustainable so that Russia can fight the longer war, a war that will be more and more difficult over time.
Some people compare this announcement of changing the Minister of Defense with Robert McNamara in United States during the Vietnam War, and that not go well. CEO of a car factory does not know how to conduct the war.
Yeah, and some other people have actually compared these to World War II and Germany with Albert Speer as well, but I don't think that we should make historic parallels because it's very different in the United States, in Germany, and in Russia, and the times are very different as well. I don't think that Russia actually had a choice in terms of they actually have to cut on some spending, and they actually have to make the MOD more efficient, and the defense industry is more efficient. So Russia doesn't really have a choice. And this is actually a very telling disappointment because it shows that the situation isn't as good for Russia as they try to claim on the international scene.
And what about the shortages on Ukrainian side? And especially, do you have some new information on F-16s, for example? How does that operation going?
Ukraine has been having shortages of basically everything since the beginning of the war. There's a common misconception that Ukraine lacks men. Ukraine doesn't lack manpower. Ukraine has millions of men who have not been mobilized yet. But Ukraine lacks instructors and equipment, so it cannot just suddenly mobilize the whole economy and the whole people to make them an army. So Ukraine lacks everything. Recently, they've been getting more and more shells and FPV drones, which helps. And as you said, we don't know the exact date, but within the next few weeks, we can expect the first F-16 jets to arrive. The number that will initially arrive is not going to be very big, so we cannot expect any big changes right away. But with Sweden's announcement yesterday to send some early warning aircrafts and also the F-16s arriving, we can expect that within the next 6 months or so, Ukraine's situation in the air will improve because these early warning planes will also help with the old Soviet jets, which don't have such a good vision of what's going on around them, but these will help with that potentially, and these will help also to operate the F-16, and it's really a force multiplier. And if we combine the upcoming air defense systems that have been promised, the Netherlands is currently trying to get one more Patriot battery. Germany has promised one, and hopefully we will find some more somewhere else for Ukraine. And Ukraine's situation in terms of air defense and air force is expected to improve, but slowly. No huge changes will happen suddenly. One last point. Russia has had a huge advantage in terms of glide bombs during this war, and this has been one of the few really successful things for the Russian defense industry during this war. They're cheap, they can be produced in huge amounts, and they're decently precise nowadays. Ukraine has been lacking those because it doesn't have that big of an air force and it doesn't have that many bombs. But Ukraine has recently integrated the SDB, GBU-39 SDB glide bombs to its MiG-29 jets. And they will also be used from the F-16s, and that's a really big plus because those are quite cheap, very precise, have a lot of range, and they've been produced in huge quantities. So that will really help Ukraine to catch up a bit on glide bombs with Russia.
Joni, thank you very much for this insightful analysis.